The sickening, metallic stench of fresh copper and burning sulfur filled my car's damp cabin exactly 3 seconds before the phantom headlights materialized out of thin air, violently shattering the pitch-black fog of Route 9 with an unnatural, blinding intensity that immediately made my eyes bleed from the sheer strain of looking at my rearview mirror. I was completely alone on that desolate stretch of Oregon Highway at 2:30 a.m., surrounded by miles of suffocating, ancient pine trees that seemed to lean over the wet asphalt like the jagged bars of an endless cage, when a rusted, late 1990s pickup truck closed a half-mile gap in a literal fraction of a second, pinning its jagged metal bumper mere millimeters away from my rear trunk. My heart violently slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird as I floorboarded the gas pedal, pushing my older sedan to a dangerous, hydroplaning 85 miles per hour through the treacherous, winding forest roads. But the shadow truck matched my speed in absolute, eerie silence. There was no mechanical engine roar, no tires screeching against the wet, black pavement, just the dead, crushing weight of a predatory anomaly pursuing me through the midnight mist. The digital dashboard gauges in my car began to spin erratically, the needles dropping to zero as the radio suddenly burst into high volume, distorted static that gradually morphed into the unmistakable sound of a child weeping in agony, while the ambient temperature inside my vehicle plummeted so low that my breath formed thick, white frost plumes that froze instantly onto the leather steering wheel. The predatory vehicle pulled into the left lane, matching my exact speed of 90 miles per hour, its massive, rusted frame hovering directly alongside my driver's side door, forcing me to glance over into the blinding, freezing glare of its dark cabin. My sanity fractured into a million pieces when I realized the truck's interior was a void of absolute, light-absorbing darkness. Yet sitting in the driver's seat was a towering, emaciated entity whose face was a shifting, boiling mass of black smoke, save for 2 glowing, hollow white sockets where eyes should have been. The creature's elongated neck was snapped and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle entirely toward me, staring straight into the deepest corners of my soul while a wet, rhythmic clicking hiss began to broadcast directly through my tightly rolled-up glass windows, vibrating the plastic of my dashboard and echoing inside the chambers of my own mind until my ears throbbed with pressure. In a frenzy of primal panic, I slammed on my brakes to let it overshoot me. But the physical laws of momentum completely vanished as the phantom truck instantaneously dissolved into the black mist, only to rematerialize directly in front of my hood, its brake lights bleeding a dark, viscous, foul-smelling black fluid that hissed and bubbled maliciously against the wet pavement. Desperate to escape this demonic stalker, I violently cut the steering wheel to the right, drifting my car across a narrow, decaying wooden bridge that spanned a pitch-black river canyon. And as I risked a look in the rearview mirror, the truck dissolved into a towering cloud of ash that smelled of decaying human remains. I didn't stop driving until I crashed through the barriers of a brightly lit, 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of civilization, sobbing hysterically as I waited for the state deputies to arrive. But their subsequent investigation uncovered a reality far worse than the chase itself. There were absolutely no tire tracks, no oil spills, and no signs of another vehicle on that foggy wooden bridge. But sitting perfectly in the center of the guardrail was a fresh, warm Polaroid photo. A high-definition aerial shot of me sleeping peacefully in my own bed from the night before, taken from an angle that could only be achieved if something had been hovering directly against my bedroom ceiling. The true terror, however, has never left me, because every single night since that encounter, when I look out my second-story apartment window into the dark street below, I see those exact 2 yellow, blinding high beams parked in the shadows, its silent engine idling as the black smoke inside the cabin slowly presses against the glass. Waiting for the night, I finally dared to drive again. As the weeks dragged on, the psychological decay deepened, twisting my waking life into a continuous waking nightmare, where every shadow in my peripheral vision took the shape of that rusted, monolithic pickup truck, its presence anchoring itself to the corners of my mind like an incurable disease. I began staying awake for days at a time, relying on heavy prescription stimulants just to keep my eyelids from closing, because I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that the moment I slipped into REM sleep, the entity would bridge the gap between my dreams and reality, pulling me back onto that fog-shrouded highway where time stood completely still. My apartment became a fortress of artificial light. I bought industrial-grade halogen bulbs, lining them up along the windowsills and pointing them directly down into the empty street, desperate to wash out the darkness where those two yellow eyes kept their eternal vigil. But the light provided no sanctuary from the supernatural decay, as the smell of burning sulfur began to manifest inside my sealed living room, rising from the floorboards and embedding itself into the fabric of my clothes until everything I touched smelled of the grave. One night, around 2:30 a.m., the halogen bulbs began to violently hum, their filaments vibrating with an aggressive, low-frequency pitch that made my teeth ache before they simultaneously exploded into showers of white-hot sparks, plunging me into absolute blackness. In the sudden silence that followed, the digital clock on my microwave didn't just lose power. Its green LED display began frantically counting backward, ticking away the seconds, minutes, and hours until it locked onto the exact time of my original encounter, 2:30 a.m. Then came the sound from the street below, the heavy, rhythmic metallic clack-clack-clack of a rusty tailgate being dropped open, followed by a wet, clicking hiss that didn't come from outside the window, but from the dark hallway right behind my back, confirming that the vehicle was no longer waiting in the shadows. It had finally parked inside my bedroom, and as I turned around, the blinding high beams turned on from within my own closet, pinning me against the wall as the dark silhouette stepped out into the room. There is an agonizing, bone-chilling sound that a heavy brass padlock makes right before a malevolent entity shatters it from the inside out, and that sound violently echoed through my empty suburban Ohio house at exactly 3:14 a.m., marking the beginning of my descent into absolute madness. I had moved into the isolated 2-story historical property just 2 weeks prior, seeking a quiet environment for my freelance graphic design business. But instead, I found myself trapped inside an architectural aberration that felt less like a home and more like a conscious, predatory trap designed to devour my mind. As a violent midnight thunderstorm rattled the ancient leaded windows, a freezing, putrid draft carrying the unmistakable odor of a fresh, open grave began blowing up from the kitchen hallway, signaling that the forbidden basement door, the one my landlord swore was welded shut for safety, had been thrown wide open. Clutching a heavy iron crowbar in my trembling, sweaty hands, I crept downstairs into the suffocating darkness, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, until I reached the threshold where the shattered brass lock rested in a widening pool of thick, black, oily moisture that seemed to pulsate to its own hidden heartbeat. Suddenly, before I could even take a step back, a chorus of guttural, disembodied voices began to whisper directly from the solid drywall surrounding me, their overlapping tones mimicking the exact inflections of dead relatives I hadn't thought about in decades. The voices did not speak in incoherent babble. They began reciting my deepest, most private childhood traumas, hidden guilts, and recurring night terrors in a terrifying, rhythmic unison that felt like thousands of icy needles piercing directly into my eardrums and carving into my brain until I dropped to my knees, screaming for them to stop. I lunged backward in sheer horror, violently jamming a heavy wooden kitchen chair beneath the antique doorknob to barricade the cellar before fleeing upstairs to lock myself inside my small office, clutching a baseball bat and counting every single agonizing second while the house shook from the supernatural energy vibrating beneath the floorboards. When the morning sun finally broke through the storm clouds, I forced myself to go back downstairs, desperately hoping to convince my fractured psyche that I had simply suffered a severe, stress-induced panic attack. But my heart completely stopped when I entered the kitchen and saw the heavy wooden chair thrown across the room, splintered into toothpicks. Leading out from the dark basement staircase were wet, muddy footprints of bare human feet, But as I tracked them across the hardwood floor, my skin crawled with a primordial dread because the prints didn't just walk through the kitchen. They trailed directly up the stairs, entered my office, and stopped precisely at the edge of my desk where I had been hiding. The police arrived within 15 minutes and launched a massive sweep of the property, ultimately discovering a hidden crawl space behind the basement drywall that contained a moldy, blood-stained sleeping bag and a small leather notebook filled with hundreds of pages detailing my exact daily routine, down to the second I brushed my teeth. But the true psychological horror peaked when the lead detective handed me the book and my eyes locked onto the messy, erratic handwriting. It was a flawless, identical match to my own signature, containing thoughts I had never spoken aloud to a single living soul. Before I could even scream, the kitchen lights violently shattered overhead, plunging the room into a dim twilight, and from the dark ventilation shaft in the wall, a pale, impossibly long arm with elongated, double-jointed fingers slowly slid out into the open air. It was followed by a translucent, veined face that looked exactly like mine, except its eyes had been violently gouged out into bleeding hollow pits, and its unhinged jaw stretched all the way down to its collarbone in a silent, mocking grin that broadcasted a loud, jarring digital alarm clock sound directly from its throat. I abandoned every single possession I owned and fled the state that very afternoon. But the nightmare followed me because now, every time I close my eyes to sleep in my new apartment, I can hear that exact same unhinged, hollow jaw clicking softly inside my bedroom closet, accompanied by a low whisper telling me that my reflection is getting tired of waiting for me to open the door. The paranoia morphed into a tangible weight that crushed my ability to function, forcing me to map out every emergency exit, every blind spot, and every light switch in my new living space with a frantic, obsessive desperation that alienated me from anyone who tried to help. I stopped looking into mirrors entirely, covering every reflective surface in the apartment with heavy black towels because I knew that if I caught a glimpse of my own eyes, I wouldn't see my reflection. I would see those empty, bleeding sockets staring back at me from the other side of the glass. The air in my bedroom began to grow permanently humid and stagnant, thick with that foul, earthy stench of decaying soil that no amount of chemical air fresheners could mask, settling deep into my mattress until sleeping felt like lying in an open trench. One evening, while sitting in the center of my living room surrounded by 3 active baby monitors to catch any ambient sound, the audio channel suddenly cut out, replaced by a low, synchronized hum that vibrated the structural plaster of my walls. Then, through the static of the speakers, my own voice began to broadcast, weeping softly and recounting the exact events of the day I abandoned the Ohio house, detailed with a cold, journalistic precision that made my skin turn to goose flesh. The closet door at the end of the hall began to slowly creak open, its hinges groaning under a weight that defied the physical structure of the wood, revealing a single, elongated pale hand gripping the white frame. The fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic pattern against the wood, 1, 2, 3, 4, matching the exact cadence of my own heartbeat, while the digital clock on my nightstand locked on at 3:14 a.m., cementing the terrifying truth that no matter how many miles I put between myself and that house, the crawl space wasn't down in the basement anymore. It was growing inside my own ribs, expanding its darkness until there was no room left for me to breathe, and as the wood splintered, my own faceless doppelganger crawled out from the ceiling vent, dropping silently onto the floor right in front of my paralyzed body. You do not truly comprehend the absolute terror of isolation until the industrial grid power of a 100,000 square foot shipping warehouse completely dies at 3:14 a.m. and the wet, heavy sound of inverted, rhythmic breathing begins to echo from the structural iron rafters directly above your head. I was working the graveyard shift as a logistics coordinator in an isolated facility in upstate New York, completely cut off from the rest of civilization by a historic winter blizzard that had drifted snow all the way up to the security windows, leaving me entirely alone within the concrete labyrinth. The very second the primary backup generators failed, the digital clocks on my office monitors began rapidly looping backward into the past, spinning through years and decades while the ambient temperature dropped so low that the reinforced glass walls of my coordinator's bubble began to crack and spiderweb under the sudden, violent freeze. Through the thick, heavy darkness of the endless inventory aisles, the distinct, rhythmic clacking of heavy steel-toed boots began to echo, but the terrifying sounds weren't originating from the concrete floor below. Something massive, agile, and inherently wrong was walking upside down along the high corrugated metal ceiling, tracking my movements with impossible geometric precision. I raised my heavy tactical flashlight with a hand that shook so violently I could barely hold it, its beam flickering and distorting into an erratic strobe light as it illuminated a towering, emaciated silhouette crawling across the high steel beams with its limbs bent backward at broken, insectoid angles. The entity did not drop from the ceiling. It literally floated downward through the freezing air, defying every known law of gravity, and slammed its distorted, pale body hard against my office door, pressing its face flush against the cracked glass window. As I stared in a state of paralyzed, silent horror, the creature's features began to violently shift and liquefy, morphing rapidly until I was looking directly into a perfect, flawless reflection of my own face. A doppelganger with black, dead veins tracing across its translucent skin and a hollow, weeping darkness where its eyes should have been. The entity unhinged its massive jaw to an impossible degree, and instead of a human scream, the deafening, jarring blare of an old digital emergency broadcast tone erupted from its throat, vibrating through my skull so intensely that warm blood began to trickle from my nose and ears. I dialed 911 on the landline desk phone in a blind panic as the wood of the door frame began to splinter under the creature's immense, supernatural pressure, finally sprinting out of the side emergency doors into the blinding whiteout of the snowstorm just as the headlights of the morning shift trucks arrived to break my isolation. The subsequent police sweep revealed no physical footprints in the fresh snow, no broken locks, and no signs of any living intruder inside the facility. But every single computer monitor inside the warehouse was permanently burned with a static, high-definition aerial image of me sleeping in my bed from the previous week. I resigned that very morning, but the true horror is that the shift never actually ended for me, because yesterday I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror out of the corner of my eye, and while I was standing perfectly still, my reflection slowly turned its head toward me, unhinged its jaw, and began to bleed black fluid from its eyes as it whispered that it's finally ready to trade places. In the days that followed that midwinter breakdown, my perception of reality began to tear at the seams, leaving me unable to distinguish between my own thoughts and the foreign, static-filled frequencies that kept echoing through the local radio stations whenever I drove past an empty industrial park. The face in the mirror didn't just haunt my bathroom. It began appearing in the dark screens of my turned-off television, the reflective surfaces of my kitchen appliances, and even the dark puddles of rain on the city streets, always maintaining that same wide, jaw-dropped grin that defied the anatomy of human flesh. I stopped sleeping in my bed entirely, choosing to collapse from sheer exhaustion on the hard linoleum floor of my kitchen where there were no windows and no high angles for something to hover over me while my defenses were down. Yet, the supernatural isolation only intensified as the digital electronics in my possession began to systematically fail one by one, their internal software corrupting until every device I owned displayed nothing but a continuous loop of static security footage from that upstate New York warehouse. My phone would ring at random intervals throughout the night, and when I finally gathered the courage to pick up the receiver, there would be no voice on the other end, only the distant, hollow echo of steel-toed boots clacking against concrete, accompanied by the low, mechanical blare of that emergency broadcast tone vibrating through the speaker. I realized with an absolute, freezing clarity that the doppelganger wasn't trying to scare me from a distance. It was systematically erasing my presence from the physical world, absorbing my habits, my memories, and my identity until I was nothing more than a ghost lingering in my own apartment. Last night, as the clock on my microwave ticked backward to 3:14 a.m. once again, the locks on my front door clicked open simultaneously from the inside, and the heavy, Inverted breathing filled the dark hallway right outside my kitchen refuge, forcing me to realize that the morning crew isn't coming to save me this time, and the shift is finally over. The air turned completely static, my skin prickling as the kitchen floor tiles began to crack open, and from the deep fissures, the pale hands of my duplicate emerged, grabbing my ankles and pulling me down into the endless concrete abyss while my own body walked away, locking the door behind it.